Vivid verses.
The hotel room smelled like recycled air and carpet cleaner, the kind of anonymous smell that tells you exactly where you are, nowhere that belongs to you. I've been traveling for a conference, 3 days of handshakes and presentations, and I was sitting on the edge of the bed in my undershirt with a cup of coffee balanced on my knee, half watching the morning news segment playing on the wall-mounted television, when I saw her face appear on the screen. Cassandra. She was seated across from the host in that particular way she had of sitting, shoulders tilted slightly toward the camera, chin at an angle that the lighting would favor. She'd practiced that. I remembered standing in the kitchen doorway, watching her rehearse for a podcast interview, adjusting her posture in the reflection of the microwave door. I'd thought it was charming at the time. I reached for the remote to turn up the volume, and my hand stopped halfway. She was talking about the patent. My patent. I set the remote down slowly. I set the coffee cup down even more slowly on the nightstand, and I sat very still and I listened. Really grew out of conversations we were having. She was saying. The host, a woman with a practiced nod, was leaning forward with the specific interest that television hosts perform when they sense a story with weight. I brought the initial framing. The architecture of the concept was something I'd been developing for a long time, and once I articulated it, the technical side came together. I noted the language. Initial framing. Architecture of the concept. Vague enough to be deniable, specific enough to plant. She was good at that, the strategic imprecision. The phrase that sounded like a claim without technically being one. The host said, "So this is your intellectual property." Cassandra smiled. She had a very good smile. I knew it well. It's something I'm incredibly proud of. The licensing conversations have been exciting. There's a company that's been in talks with me about. I picked up my phone. I wasn't angry. I want to be precise about that because I've thought about it since and I believe it matters. There was no anger. There was something colder and more deliberate. The feeling of watching a problem that needed solving rather than a betrayal that needed avenging. Anger would have made me call her. Anger would have made me type something in all capitals, or call her sister, or show up at the studio. Anger is loud, and it burns fuel, and it very rarely solves anything. What I felt was clarity. I scrolled to a contact I'd had for 3 years and used twice. His name was Raymond Cho, and he was the best intellectual property attorney I'd ever met, recommended to me by a colleague who described him as someone who makes the law feel like a scalpel. I'd retained him when I first filed. He knew the documentation. He knew every date stamp, every version log, every communication trail. I called him. It rang twice. "You're up early," he said. He was a morning person. One of those. "Are you watching Channel 4 right now?" A pause. "Give me 30 seconds. I heard the faint sound of a television being turned on, volume rising. I watched the same segment from my hotel bed, 1,500 miles from home, the coffee going cold on the nightstand, and Cassandra's voice filling the room with a story that had my work in it and her name stamped over the top. Raymond said, "That's the Hartwell licensing window." Yes, they've been in talks with her. Apparently. Another pause, shorter. She signed the dissolution agreement. She did. The IP clause was explicit. It was, "I'm going to need about 40 minutes, he said, and I could hear the quality of attention shift in his voice, the way it does when a person stops warming up and starts working. "Are you somewhere you can receive documents?" "I'm in a hotel." "I have email." "Good. Don't contact her. Don't contact the company. Don't post anything." "I wasn't going to." "I know you weren't. I'm saying it anyway because it's my job." A brief pause. "This is going to be clean, Owen." "The record is clean." "I know." We hung up. I sat for another moment and watched Cassandra finish the segment. The host thanked her warmly. They went to commercial. I turned the television off, got dressed, and went down to the hotel restaurant to eat breakfast because I hadn't eaten yet and I was hungry, and there was nothing productive I could do for the next 40 minutes anyway. I'd met Cassandra at a dinner party thrown by a mutual friend. A round table, 8 people, good wine, the kind of evening where conversation moves fast and you end up talking to the person across from you about something real before you finish the appetizer. She was sharp. That was the first thing. She picked apart an argument someone else had made with the precision of someone who'd been thinking about the subject for years, and I remember watching her do it and thinking, she's going to be interesting. She was. For a long time, she was. She worked in strategy consulting, which meant she was fluent in the language of ideas, how to position them, how to frame them, how to make them legible to an audience. When I started working on the patent, she was genuinely engaged. She asked good questions. We talked about it over dinner, on walks in the car. She had a way of listening that made you feel understood, which I now recognize as a professional skill, but at the time I took it for something more personal. The patent was mine. That's not an emotional claim. It's a legal and factual one. The invention, the documentation, the filing, the years of iteration. My name, my application number, my attorney's contact information on every piece of correspondence. Cassandra contributed exactly what she contributed. She asked questions, she named a few things in casual conversation, and once she said, "What if the input sequence ran backward?" Which was a suggestion I tried and discarded after 45 minutes of testing because it didn't work. I told her it didn't work. She nodded and we moved on. When she said I brought the initial framing on television, I understood exactly what she was referring to. She was going to reach back into the memory of those conversations and pull forward the moments that could be reframed in her favor. And the dangerous thing about that strategy is that it's nearly impossible to disprove through argument alone. Who can say what was said in a car 3 years ago? Who can produce a receipt for a conversation? The paperwork, though, the paperwork doesn't forget. I ate eggs and toast and drank 2 glasses of water and checked my email on my phone. Raymond had sent a preliminary note, subject line, action initiated, outlining what he was doing. He'd pulled the licensing agreement that bore Cassandra's name, cross-referenced it against the IP clause in the dissolution paper she had signed, and was in the process of formally revoking it. He also flagged something I hadn't known. Cassandra had been in active negotiation with Hartwell Industries for 6 weeks, which meant she'd started those conversations before the interview. The interview was, in his assessment, an attempt to establish a public record of ownership that she could point to if the documentation ever became contested. She planned this. I held that thought for a moment, not because it changed anything, but because it was worth understanding clearly. This wasn't improvised. She hadn't seen an opportunity and taken it in the moment. She'd constructed a sequence, begin talks with a company, conduct a public interview to establish provenance, leverage the interview to close the deal. Clean, strategic, very Cassandra. If I'd been a different kind of man, the kind who calls in the middle of the night, who sends long messages about betrayal and what we had, she might have had time to shore up her position before the legal machinery moved. She might have called Hartwell and framed any challenge as a contested claim, a bitter X muddying the waters. She might have bought herself weeks, but I hadn't called her. I called Raymond, and Raymond moved faster than a phone call. I finished my breakfast, left a tip, and went back upstairs to pack for my flight home. The revocation hit by Raymond's account during the second commercial break of the same broadcast. The licensing agreement bearing Cassandra's name was formally dissolved while she was still in the studio, probably accepting compliments from the production team. I found that detail neither satisfying nor amusing. It was simply the timeline. The paperwork moved when it moved, and the fact that it coincided with the broadcast window was logistically convenient, nothing more. I flew home. The flight was uneventful. I read a technical journal I'd been meaning to get to for weeks, and then I slept for an hour somewhere over the middle of the country. And when I landed, I turned my phone off airplane mode and had 17 messages from a number I didn't need to check to identify. I didn't read them, not because I was making a statement. I simply didn't have anything to add to the conversation, and I knew with reasonable certainty that whatever Cassandra had written was designed to produce a response from me. A response was leverage. A response was evidence of engagement. A response was the beginning of the argument she wanted to have, where she could be articulate and persuasive and reframe the whole situation as a misunderstanding. I was not going to have that argument. I texted Raymond, "Home. Anything I need to know?" He replied in 4 minutes. "Hartwell pulled out this morning. Their legal confirmed once the documentation surfaced, they withdrew. She may reach out to you directly. Don't engage without me." I replied, "Understood." I drove home. I made dinner. I called my brother, who knew nothing about any of this and wanted to talk about a home renovation he was planning, and I listened to him describe his plans for the back patio for 25 minutes and offered some thoughts on drainage. And when we hung up, I felt considerably more like a person than I had all day. The call came 3 days later. I'd expected it sooner, which told me she'd spent those 3 days trying to find another angle before accepting that the direct conversation was the only move left. That was also very Cassandra. She was not the kind of person who admitted she needed to talk to you until she'd exhausted every other option. I answer on the 3rd ring. Not the 1st. You don't need to be eager. Not the 4th. You don't need to perform indifference. Owen. Her voice was controlled. She'd prepared. Cassandra. A pause. She was waiting to see if I'd fill the silence. I didn't. I think we need to talk about what happened. I think Raymond has handled it pretty thoroughly, I said. Raymond doesn't know everything. He knows what's documented. I kept my voice even. Not cold. I wasn't trying to punish her with tone. Just level. That tends to be sufficient. What I said in that interview, she stopped. Started again. I wasn't claiming the patent. I was talking about the process. Our process. We worked on this together, Owen. You know that. I'd prepared for this too, in a quiet way that comes naturally to me. Not scripted, but thought through. I knew what she was going to say because I know how she builds an argument. She starts with the emotional claim. We worked on this together because it's the hardest to refute directly. You sound petty if you start listing your own contributions. Cassandra, I said, you told a television host, and through that host a company that was in active licensing negotiations with you, that the architecture of the concept was something you had been developing. That's not describing a process. That's describing authorship. Silence. The documentation says something different, I continued. It said something different when you signed it, and it says something different now. That's not my interpretation. That's the record. You didn't have to do it during the broadcast. There was an edge now, tightly controlled but present. That was designed to humiliate me. I considered that for a moment. Was she right? Had there been some part of the timing that was punitive? No. Raymond moved when he could move. I hadn't directed the timing, but I also noticed that I didn't feel particularly compelled to defend myself on the point, because the why behind the timing was less important than the what. The action was correct regardless of when it happened. I wasn't managing your broadcast schedule, I said. I called my attorney when I needed to call my attorney. Owen. Her voice changed register. Lower, more personal. This was the second gear. We were together for years. We built something. Whatever happened with the patent? What happened with the patent, I said, is that you tried to license something you don't own, using a public interview to establish a paper trail of authorship that doesn't exist. I wasn't raising my voice. I was saying exactly what was true plainly. I understand that you framed this differently for yourself. That's your business. But it's not something I'm going to discuss in a way that treats the two framings as equivalent, because they aren't. She was quiet for a long moment. Is there anything you need from me, I said, that would require this conversation? Because if there's paperwork left to sign, Raymond can facilitate that. I'm not talking about paperwork. I know. Another silence. Longer this time. You're very good at this, she said, and her voice had shifted again. Not soft exactly, but the performance had come down a fraction, and what was underneath it was harder to read. Something tired, maybe, something that recognized it had run out of angles. The distance, the control. I'm not performing anything, I said. I'm just not angry. That's almost worse. I'm sorry it feels that way. And I meant it in the way you can mean something and also know that the meaning of it doesn't change what needs to happen. But I'm not going to make this easier by pretending there's a version of events where what you did was something other than what it was. She said my name again, quietly. I think she was going to say something else, make one more pass at the conversation she wanted to have, the one where I argued back, and she could argue back harder, where we went back and forth, and at the end of it there was a different outcome written in the margin. Take care of yourself, Cassandra, I said, and I ended the call. I sat at my kitchen table for a while afterward, not processing exactly, more like letting the quiet settle. The evening light was doing something orange and gradual through the window over the sink, and I had a mug of tea I'd made before she called and hadn't touched yet. I thought about what she'd said. You're very good at this. The distance, the control. I turned it over a few times, looking for the place where it landed on me. She'd meant it as an accusation, or at least as an observation shaped like one. The implication being that a person who doesn't break, who doesn't raise their voice, who deals in documentation instead of confrontation, is somehow failing to feel the appropriate things. Missing something human. I disagree. What she was calling distance, I'd call clarity. What she was calling control, I'd call the decision not to let someone use my reaction against me. I'd felt the full weight of what she'd done. The years of conversation she'd reached back into and curated, the calculated sequence of talks and interviews, the particular audacity of going on television and saying the architecture of the concept was something I'd been developing with the confidence of someone who decided the historical record was soft enough to reshape. I felt all of that. I just didn't perform it for her benefit. There's a version of this story where I confront her at the studio or leave a message she can play for sympathy or send a long email at 2 in the morning that gives her exactly the evidence she needs that I'm reactive, that I'm compromised, that my feelings about the relationship have infected my relationship with the facts. There's a version where she gets to call her friends afterward and describe what I said and position herself as someone being pursued by an angry ex. That version doesn't exist because I called Raymond. The correction ran 2 days later. I saw it in passing, a brief segment, a different host filling in, a quiet note that the patent discussed in a previous interview was sole registered to its inventor, and that licensing discussions were being managed through the appropriate legal channels. The kind of sentence that sounds like nothing and means everything. Raymond forwarded me the clip with a note. Concise. Professional. Effective. I replied, "Thank you for everything on this." He replied, "That's what the retainer's for. Let me know if anything else surfaces." Nothing else surfaced. I received one more message from Cassandra. Not a call this time, a text sent at 11:43 on a Tuesday night. It read, "I hope you know that I did care about you. Whatever you think of me now, that part was real." I read it twice. I thought about it for a moment, genuinely thought about it, gave it the consideration it deserved. Then I put my phone face down on the table and went back to what I've been working on. The dissolution paperwork, the final piece, the last signature, came through Raymond's office on a Thursday afternoon. He sent it digitally, flagged the relevant signature lines, and included a note that said, "This closes it out completely. You're free and clear on all fronts." I read through it, all of it. I'm the kind of person who reads the documents I sign, which sounds like it shouldn't need saying, but apparently does. I read the clauses, the effective dates, the language around the IP, the finality clause that specified no further claims could arise from the relationship, in any of its forms. It was clean. Raymond was right. It was clean, thorough, and final. I signed it with the kind of steadiness that comes not from suppression, but from completion. The thing was finished. It had been finished for longer than the paperwork acknowledged. Finished, in a sense, the moment I sat in a hotel room and watched her on television and felt not grief but calculation, not loss, but the clean mechanical sense of a problem that needed solving. I submitted the signed documents at 3:27 in the afternoon, closed my laptop, and made coffee. The light through the window was different in the afternoon than in the evening, sharper, more direct, the kind of light that doesn't soften things. I stood at the counter and drank my coffee and looked at the light on the floor and thought about the next version of the patent filing, the expanded application I'd been building toward for a year, the iteration that made the original look like a first draft. There was a lot of work left to do. I was glad for it. 3 weeks later, on a Saturday, I was at my friend Garrett's place for a small dinner. 6 people, his back patio, string lights he'd hung himself and was very proud of, the kind of evening that doesn't require much from anyone. I'd known Garrett since before any of this. He knew the broad strokes, but not the details, and he had the good sense not to ask. One of the other guests was a woman named Petra, and then I caught myself because that name was in the constraint list rattling around the back of my head from some other story in some other register of awareness, and the real woman at the table was named Mirabelle, which suited her better anyway. She worked in material science. She had opinions about concrete that I found genuinely interesting. She asked me what I was working on, and I gave her the abbreviated version, a licensing framework, an expanded application, some technical challenges I was midway through, and she listened with the particular attention of someone who was actually curious rather than performing curiosity. It was a small thing, but I noticed it. Garrett had made ribs, which he'd been threatening to do for months, and they were as good as he'd promised. And somewhere around the second hour, someone brought out a board game that half the table knew and half the table didn't. And there was the good-natured argument that produces, and the evening went the way those evenings go when the people around the table are decent and the weather is cooperating and nobody needs anything in particular from anyone else. I drove home later than I expected, in the easy way of good evenings. The roads were quiet. I had the window down partway. I thought about Cassandra briefly, not with regret, not with anger, just the way you think about a chapter that's closed. What she'd done was calculated and deliberate, and she'd underestimated the stability of the record. That was her mistake. She was smart enough to construct the plan and not quite careful enough to account for how thoroughly I documented everything from the beginning. Not because I'd anticipated betrayal, but because documentation is simply what you do when you're serious about the work. The patent was whole. The licensing was moving through the right channels now, at my pace with my name on it. The work was continuing. She wanted to rewrite the ending, I think. That's what the phone call was really about, not the licensing, not even the money. She wanted the chance to talk her way into a version of events that was more flattering, more collaborative, more open to interpretation. She was very good at that in conversation. She could hold a sentence up to the light and turn it until it looked like something different. But I hadn't given her the conversation. I'd given her the paperwork, and the paperwork doesn't turn. 2 months after the final signature, I got a message from a colleague I respected, a man named Conrad who ran a small firm and had been following the patent's public filings with professional interest. He'd seen the Hartwell situation from the outside and, to his credit, had done enough research to understand what actually happened before he reached out. His message was direct. He was interested in a legitimate licensing conversation. His firm had an application that would pair well with the technology. He wasn't asking for anything yet, just whether I was open to a discussion. I read it standing at my kitchen counter on a Tuesday morning, mug in hand. Open to a discussion. Yes, that was the right language. Not a negotiation disguised as a conversation. not an attempt to establish something through the back door of casual dialogue. A direct statement of interest and an honest question. I wrote back, I am. Let's get on a call this week. We got on a call 2 days later. Conrad was precise and prepared, which I appreciate. He'd read the documentation. He knew what he was asking about and what he was offering. We talked for 40 minutes and established enough of a foundation to schedule a follow-up with his legal team and Raymond. That's how it's supposed to work. That's what the work deserves. I ended the call, sat back in my chair, and looked at my notes from the conversation. The next iteration was taking shape in a way I could almost feel. The expanded filing, the applications I hadn't had time to pursue, while the previous year's complications were ongoing, the parts of the work I'd been most excited about that had been sitting patiently in the background, waiting. No regrets. That's the part people don't always believe, but it's true. Not the clean your hands, put it behind you version of no regrets, which is really just suppression wearing a more dignified label. The actual version. The accounting has been done and the numbers come out right. The record is clean. The work is intact. The chapter closed the way chapters should close. Fully, without loose edges, without the unfinished business of an argument that never landed cleanly enough. You don't get to that place through anger. Anger wants a response. Anger needs the other person to understand, to acknowledge, to be seen doing the wrong thing, and then caught doing the wrong thing, and then confronted with it in a way that produces visible consequence. Anger is contingent. It requires the other person's participation to complete. What I'd done required nothing from Cassandra except her original signature on a document she'd apparently forgotten she signed. The paperwork completed itself. On a Friday evening, later in the season, I met Mirabelle again. She was friends with Garrett's partner, as it turned out, and there was a smaller version of the same back patio gathering, for people, the kind of evening that's easier than 6. She was working through a problem in her research and explained it while we cleared the dinner plates. The two of us moving around the kitchen in the easy rhythm that happens when two people have similar spatial instincts, neither of them getting in each other's way. She paused in the middle of the explanation and said, "Sorry, is this interesting at all? Or am I do this, I go on." "You're not going on," I said. I asked. She looked at me for a moment, assessing whether I meant it. Then she continued. Later, on the drive home, I thought about the quality of that. Someone telling you a real thing and you listening to the real thing rather than to the performance of the real thing. How often that doesn't happen and how good it is when it does. The work was moving forward. The licensing conversation with Conrad's firm was in its second round. The expanded application was drafted and under review. The patent was mine, cleanly and permanently, the way anything earned is yours. Not because someone gave you credit, but because the record shows every step you took to build it, and the record doesn't negotiate. I drove home through the quiet, the window down, the night air cool and clean, thinking about the next version of the work, what it would need, where it would go, what I hadn't yet solved. There was a lot left to build. I was looking forward to it.
Thanks for listening.